Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the Financial Advisors Want to Know podcast. I'm Catherine Tindall, a CPA. Our firm works specifically with advisors on their tax and accounting needs. But today's episode, I have Liz Hand with me. She's a CFP and the owner of Pleasant Wealth, which is a boutique firm in Ohio that serves women nearing retirement. She's also an executive coach for advisors who are ready to show up more confidently in their work. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing on succession questions when you have internal succession to family members and what's involved with that process and the mindset that you need to bring to that process. So thanks for joining me today, Liz.
I love this conversation and I'm excited to have it with you, Catherine.
So this is something I've encountered quite a bit in my practice with clients of people where they have other family members that are in the business and they're trying to figure out succession. And there's always a different planning attitude to it when it's when it's a family relationship versus maybe an employee who's grown up through the ranks, et cetera. What kind of advice do you have for people where they can see this on the horizon? You know, maybe they have kids that have been in the business for a while and they're getting ready to start thinking about this conversation. Where do you recommend people start?
I think that more conversation earlier is better. And there's a way sometimes that I think people want to kick the tin can down the road, but we have so much built into assumptions and what we want or don't want that just starting the conversation with an open hand, recognizing that we're not going to pin anybody down as they're working out their thoughts, supports everybody in the process along the way. It actually kind of made me curious when you said there's a different attitude when you come to family succession. What do you see in that?
Well, I think it's a lot messier, right? Because for a lot of people, if you're approaching an internal person about a succession plan, if things go awry, it's not going to mess with, your ability to go see your grandchildren and that sort of thing, right? It's really, you can make a very level-headed, rational business decision with that person and be very objective. When it's your own children, it's, or, nieces, nephews, whoever it is that's in the business, it's just much more pressure to get it right. And then I think also there can be unclear expectations of where the boundaries are, where it's easy for maybe a younger family member to think they're entitled to the practice. And maybe the owner doesn't think the kids have earned their stripes yet. Right. So that's what I've seen. What have you seen in practice? You've probably seen this more than I have.
It's interesting. When you said that, I'm like, oh yeah, of course. It's the hat switching that happens inside the conversations. So I've been in a family business for 16 years now. Who am I talking to when I'm talking to Clinton, my business partner? Am I talking to my brother? Am I talking to my business partner? Am I talking to the advisor of the firm? Am I talking to, we wear these different roles and these different hats. And if we're not pretty clear on who we are being in that moment, it can quickly bring in hurts from other places or judgments or misunderstandings. I remember this one conversation I was having with my dad, and we're talking about one specific thing that I felt, I don't even remember what the exact thing was, but it was something specific about the succession process where I saw one way that it needed to go for the firm after my dad was out of the firm. And he asked the question, he's like, so does this mean I don't get to see my grandchildren? I was like, what? Where did that come from? And that also throws whoever, if we're not very clear, whoever is trying to communicate an idea and feels really passionate about it will get thrown off. That's where the anger can come in, yelling. That's where crying can come in. A lot of different emotions just surface when we're not really clear about who we're being in that moment.
That's very true. And I think in particular with succession planning, because you're talking about such a momentous transaction, it can also really change the character of things because it can come into, well, what am I worth to this, as the younger generation, what am I worth to my parents as an employee? Or as you're, from the parents' perspective of, how much of this should I hand off and what's the timing of that, et cetera. And I've seen a lot of those transitions seem to go really well. A lot of it seems to come down to the rapport that you have as a working relationship prior to talking about succession issues and change management and also just the personalities involved. But so for people that are trying to approach those conversations and don't want to trigger the tears, what are some tactical tips that you have to approaching that conversation in a way that's not going to trigger, or maybe you think that those things do need to be triggered and need to be drawn out in the open. What do you think about that?
There's likely no way that you can avoid tripping a wire of someone because each person enters a conversation and the job of their subconscious mind is to delete, distort, and generalize information. So if they are not super conscious about the way that they're being or the way that they're interpreting, it's going through automated filters. That's what mindset work is. And so just expect that anger might show up, or that tears might show up, or that there might be moments of really ecstatic joy. And that's okay. Like, all of those things are welcome as long as you have the container of space to talk about it. I will say that with the process, we have to remember that in succession, especially within a family, it's a changing of power, and there's different power dynamics within a family. When you have an adult and a child, that's one power dynamic. When that child gets older and it becomes maybe more apt in their brain power, and there's maybe some recession from the older, that's a different power dynamic. When you have caregiving happening for a waning adult, that's a different power dynamic. All of those things happen in process with life. And when you take into the business into consideration, where you have someone who came into the business not knowing much, someone who ran the business, started the business, whatever, all the opinions, and then that shifts over time where dynamics of the industry change, and maybe they're not staying up as to date as it. Anybody who's not watching this, I'm using my hands in a particular way to show that the power dynamics shift, and that's a really uncomfortable thing to experience if it's not named. And part of it's just naming, like, this is normal, this is the process. Change is difficult because you are handing a baton to somebody else, and there's inherent trust that's needed. There's also inherent difference of opinions. And so one's choice of how to manage the investments versus another's choice of how to do HR stuff, like, we have to make space that these difference of opinions are okay, and there's still trust built into the process.
Yeah. Do you have like a recommended communication rhythm that people should have for these kinds of situations?
Consistent rhythm. I don't know. What do you mean when you ask rhythm?
Oh, like, for instance, like in our firm, we have a one-to-one process that happens every month for people's direct reports, where it's a pretty serious heart-to-heart conversation. That's, where do you see yourself going? Where are you doing well? Where do you need support? And then just, how are different work projects, those get measured a little separately, but how frequently do you think people should be checking in kind of on the, like, do you think that a formal meeting structure should be implemented for stuff like this? Or how do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we did have consistent meetings on the calendar to talk about the succession process. I think once the change is happening, usually more communication is better than less. What I've also noticed is that there's kind of phases. And so not getting overly attached to the cadence, but recognizing, and maybe even putting that on the table of saying, we're going to be meeting once a week from now until whenever, and we're going to decide in 3 months if this meeting is still relevant or not. If it's not, we're shifting it to a weekly check-in via email. Because there's a lot of things you don't want to be left to assumption. And so sometimes that face-to-face communication can really show when someone is feeling off or distant or really engaged or really animated. And meetings can take time, and we don't need to be sitting in meetings all the time for meeting's sake. And so I think just recognizing that meetings have a time and a space, and sometimes they've served their purpose and it's ready to restructure.
That's good to know. So I guess another shift in this, because I always think of, when going through a big change, you want to assemble the resources that you're going to need to do that. And I think it would be nice to discuss, what do you think for professionals people should have around them during this process? Like, when they should be engaging people, what should people be assembling for resources on the mindset side in some of these conversations? And when do you think that should start to be explored?
I don't know that I have a recipe for that, but I know that for myself, when we were talking about succession, I had a coach at the time. How early did that start? I think I had a coach for about 1.5 years before the actual transaction occurred. And then I've had a coach ever since the transaction occurred, even to present day. Those have been really helpful for me as I'm stepping into leadership too. Being the second gen, there's a lot of considerations about team members and what they expect from the firm, sticking around in nostalgia. This is how it used to be. It never was that way before. Or, wow, this is a lot of change. Like, those kinds of things, being the conscious leader that steps up and addresses things as they come. There's a lot of change that you're managing. And so having that outlet and that person that's checking your approach, that you are able to bounce ideas off with, is super helpful. At least it's for me. I'm a verbal processor, so it worked really well. And even Clinton, my business partner and my brother, he's had a consistent coach almost the same amount of time as me, almost the same cadence. So, and it's been helpful for him too in his own journey of stepping up. Interestingly, my father, in that process, he would have had a couple of outlets, at least like a group or two of business owners that he could talk to. They were not on a regular cadence, and that was his choice. We navigated it just fine. So I think probably personal preference and how you work things out is also key.
Yeah, that's great. And I love to hear that you guys are working with coaches, because something that I've experienced working with different clients is you really feel the difference in the level that they show up when you have like a coaching relationship.
Yeah.
It's really makes a profound difference. Well, what else do you think that people should be considering, when you look back on how this transition went for you? What are things that you felt like, oh, I wish I had known this before
Mhm.
before going into this, or things that maybe you would have changed or done differently now that you look in the rearview mirror?
Now that I have a lot of the knowledge that I have around mindset, I mean, I kind of stumbled into the support that I would recommend for someone, but really, if you had looked on paper, our succession plan was already mapped out. My father had it completely structured, the cash flow, the transaction of units. And um, it turns out that even when you have the tactical pieces in place, there's still the emotional components.
Mm-hmm.
And so, not to get blindsided by that, that is part of the process. That is part of change. Even when you have the plan in place, there's other considerations. The thing that I think took me most by surprise was the way that I had to step back in my family relationships on a personal level.
Mm-hmm.
I found it to be quite difficult to sustain the level of closeness with my parents and even some of my siblings in that process because of the emotion that was in the space. So if I had a tense conversation with my dad and we would have a family gathering that weekend, I'm still kind of processing that because I'm a human being and I can't fully separate myself out from work. And then I'm coming to this family thing. So I had different conversations with different family members at different times, just kind of level setting and saying, like, my primary concern right now is figuring out the succession place. It's from a place of love. And in doing that, I cannot show up for you in the same way that you need me to as your daughter. I cannot show up for the same way as you've needed me to in the past as your sister or whatever. That and normalizing that, I think, would be really helpful for someone as they're going through the process. I, again, stumbled into it, thought I was a bad person because I had to do it, but ultimately that's what created the most ease. And it's just for a season. I've just witnessed now we're, a couple of years into the process. I've witnessed some of those relationships kind of shifting back to their old place of engagement. And that's really exciting to see.
Oh, that's great. So I guess maybe this is a question that you may not want to answer, and you can decline if you don't want to.
Okay.
For people who are considering doing this, do you think that it's a good idea? Not that it's a good idea. Are you glad that things went the way that they did for the transition that you had, or was there more difficulty than what you initially expected in the succession process? That maybe it would have been easier to transition things in a different manner, or I was just talking to someone recently where they just purchased a section of book from the existing business with the other family members and went off and started their own thing to make it an easier transition.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel with what you did and with your family versus what you think would work for most people, and maybe challenges that you weren't expecting or things that you would have changed about the process?
Mm-hmm. I think it would have been a lot easier, a lot less intention needed if we had just parsed out part of the business and I bought that and did it on my own. And I had even pitched that to my dad a couple of years before, but it was not his interest to do that. So would I do it the same? I don't know. I don't know what other outcome I want than what I'm experiencing today. So it's hard to answer that question. But I do think that when someone asked me, like, do you want to sell to your kids? Is that a goal of yours? And the way that I've come to understand it for myself is I almost don't want to sell to my children in the future. I think it's a great opportunity that I can give them, and that's exciting. That's the part that I would want to do. But the piece that I would want to leave off the table is it just really, there's a lot of complexity in the relationship that happens when you layer several things on top of each other in your parent-child relationship. And I would much rather use the money that I have to help them start something new on their terms fully than to bring them into something that was my dream, my vision, my purpose, all my things, and then expect them to come through that and for no feathers to be ruffled. Like, I think it's just an easier friction-free relationship for my kids to launch on their own with something that they desire and maybe fund it for them. But that's where I'm at today. Like, if you interview me in 5 years, I might have a different response. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
I love that. Well, I really appreciate the conversation, Liz. This was great to get kind of your insider view on this scenario. For people who are looking to connect with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can find me there, Liz Hand. Well, it's probably Elizabeth K. Hand on LinkedIn. But then I also have a website, www.lizhandcoaching.com. And so if you're going through the process of succession, or if you're wanting to level up as a professional, that's where you can get in contact with me, and you can have a free coaching session just to see if it's a good fit.
Nice. That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the
Absolutely.
conversation.
Thanks, Catherine.
The opinions expressed on this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individuals. To determine which investments or solutions may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial advisor, or tax advisor prior to investing. Securities offered through Kestra Investment Services, LLC, Kestra IS, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Kestra Advisory Services, LLC, Kestra AS, an affiliate of Kestra IS. Pleasant Wealth, LLC is not an affiliate of Kestra IS or Kestra AS. Neither Kestra IS nor Kestra AS provides legal or tax advice.